questions. So thank you very much. I hope that you're going to help me by being quite critical and giving me feedback on the thoughts that I'm going to share with you. It's going to be quite simple, I think. And it goes back to some of the questions I've been asking about capabilities now for many years. And I want to present you with some of my thoughts on basically 3 areas. The first is what is capability? The second is what is agency? The third is where does power fit into our approach? I'm going to do this also by suggesting that there is a lot of material in the social theory that we can use and that we're not sufficiently tapping. We are an approach that came from basically economics and philosophy, not so much from the humanities. And the humanities contribution is very kind of marginal. So I'm suggesting that there's lots more that those of us that do qualitative work can integrate from what we call social theory, social philosophers. And I'm going to give some very concrete examples, but also some pointers to where I think we could go. And I'm going to use a little case study just to make it not only words. So I'm going to start with that. It's an imaginary story, but it's based on, you know, the stories that all of us hear and that I've been hearing for many, many years. So there's a set of twins, Lizzie Ware and Wesi Welly Ware, that are born in Tsolo in the Eastern Cape to a woman who is not married to the father of the children, but they live together and they have a quite close relationship. They also share a business. But then when the twins are these are identical twins. You can't tell them apart right from babyhood. They look the same. And they respond very similarly, that they develop, you know, with the same benchmarks. But then when they are 2 years old, there's a major rift between the father and the mother, starting with some of the business difficulties. They shared a business and things went wrong there, and so they decide to break up. But the father says he gets away, leaves with most of the assets from this kind of broken up business, but he then says he will take responsibility for the girl's education if he can take Weliwe along. The mother resists for a long time, but eventually gives in. Weliwe goes with the father and Liziwe stays with the mother. Not far apart, but they now see each other only at Christmas, at family celebrations. The father sends Weliwe to a school in Queenstown. She's in residence there. She gets eventually a very good matric, but she has problems with relations. Liziwe stays with her mother in the small village, goes to a very local school, but is socially very well integrated. Then the father then has put away some money and they come to the University of the Free State. And they enroll for their first year, and after 6 months, they ask for an academic advisor to look at their problems, because it turns out that Weliwe is doing very, very well academically. She's top of the class, but she's really finding it very difficult to socialize and to integrate. Liziwe, what did I say? Liziwe, is absolutely fine on the social level. In fact, she over-socializes, but she's not doing so well academically. So they end up with an advisor, and you are now, or all of us are maybe the capability attendant to that advisor. So the question for us at this point is, what are their comparable capabilities? They came into life with, we can theorize kind of maybe with a little bit of a margin here and there, but with the same potential. But because of the fact that their lives developed along such difficult or different lines, what are their capabilities at this stage? The one is doing extremely well academically. The other one is really struggling, and socially the opposite. So if this was a class, I would stop now and ask you for your responses. But as it isn't, I'll get them afterwards. So I would then argue that we need to look at what their structural opportunities are at this stage, as well as what they bring into the situation themselves. So I would say if we look at what their capabilities are, we need to actually ask what opportunities do they have. Weliwe has better academic opportunities, even though the intelligence of the twins are presumably the same. She's had better opportunities all along, and therefore she is in a better position to use the structural opportunities given by the university, the intellectual opportunities, academic achievement opportunities, and vice versa with her twin Liziwe, and the other way around with social integration. So what does that tell us about what capabilities are? I think part of my question is, where do we separate the social and the personal in terms of capabilities? If we talk about capabilities, do we see it as everything that somebody brings into a situation, and how do we distinguish agency from that? If we look at Weliwe in this conversation with the advisor, at what point do we see what she brings in, and at what point do we look at what her situation is? And so I want to argue for a position that Sen basically proposed in terms of capabilities, that they are structural opportunity sets. I'm going to come to that later again. From his 1985 work, which was later published as the Dewey Lectures, he previously talked about freedoms and all the other terms that later on still feature in his work. But from that point onwards, his work on capability focuses on this notion of opportunity. And although he never calls it structural opportunity, I want to propose that we think of it as structural opportunities, and that we don't necessarily overemphasize the personal, although I think the personal is hugely important. But I think if we're looking at higher education in South Africa, and we're looking at Weliwe and Liziwe, and we look at what happens to many other students that are around us here and in all the other universities, if we overemphasize the personal, we distort the reality, because a lot of their situation is structural. And so the question is, how do we balance this understanding of the personal, the social, and the structural? So I'm saying that capabilities are structural opportunity sets, but they are also one's own skills, capacity, talent, but that just as what you bring into the opportunity. So it's Liziwe has the same intellectual capacity as Weliwe, but it's not been developed in the same way. And so it's not manifest, it's not a real, what Sen calls a real capability, in the sense that it cannot be realized. It's not a transaction that can be realized on the instant, because other things first need to happen. There are constraints that Weliwe did not experience. So I'm also arguing that Nussbaum's terminology, where she overemphasizes the personal capacity, is not helpful and confusing. And she also says that she assumes agency, so she doesn't, for me, have a clear enough delineation of how it's understood. She has a three-part analysis of agency, but for me that again is functional. She just deliberates it by means of looking at different functions that these terms can serve. And I think we need to basically, in terms of structure or capability and agency, we are better served if we lean more heavily on Sen's work. So some people are saying the capability, because capabilities are often seen as the dictionary meaning of that which I'm able to do. So some people are referring to the capability approach, outsiders very often that haven't been working very deeply in the approach themselves. But nevertheless, people can talk about the capability approach as a pulling yourself up by your bootstraps approach. You know, if you try hard enough, you will get there. But it's not that kind of capability. If you look at everything that Sen uses as examples in his writings, it would be the capability to have good nourishment, the capability to have good education. It's not the capability to expand necessarily what you can personally do in the first instance. It comes along as a part of the opportunity set, but it's in a major way, it's structural. What is agency? So we are saying that this opportunity set needs to be engaged with by Weliwe and Liziwe. They both need to somehow use the opportunities that came their way, and how are they doing it? How this is happening has been insufficiently theorized in the capability approach. Crocker and Rabains tell us that Sen's remarks on agency are scattered comments. A bit here, a sentence there, 2 sentences there. And so we don't have a deep theory of what this agency that we talk about and that we want to all use and that we all engage with all the time, what it really is and how it interacts with social conditions. In capability terms, agency has been formulated as a choice or the ability to act. No, let me start again. The choice which has been reflected on based on what is valued, and then the ability to act on that. So that is agency. Capability theorists like Crocker and Brace then also talk about agency as the ability to act. For this we can develop indicators, dimensions, agency dimensions, which Al-Khair has done a lot of work on, and then indicators. So there's a technical process there, but the deep theorization of what exactly it is, and what it is that Liziwe and Weliwe can actually do in their situation, we need to now start to unpack. They go to this advisor. Are they just going to, wait and see what comes their way, or how do they themselves engage with it? How can we use social theory knowledge to enrich these questions? So what I'm asking, I want to just spell this out in this first sentence. I'm asking, how can we use social theory for a better understanding of the precise ways in which agency and structural opportunities can interrelate? Structural opportunity sets, a person that comes, makes a choice, engages with agency, how do they interrelate? And there's a century of debates and writings on this in social theory. It started basically with the division of the disciplines at the end of the 19th century, where economics took its terrain, and the part that economics excluded for, at that stage, ideological reasons, came towards the social discipline. And those were the questions of how people respond and what structural constraints are. Structural constraints were, by and large, some authors tell us, written out of economics, because that was not what the early capitalists wanted in their theories. They wanted to be able to operate constraint-free. And so all those critical dimensions came to the humanities. And so what is it that we can at this stage learn from that 1 century-long debate? By the way, if you're interested in going into this in depth, there's a book that was written by a German professor, Hans Joas, called The Creativity of Action. He is was a student. He's now a very famous professor himself, but he was a student of Habitus at the Frankfurt who came out of the Frankfurt School, the School of Critical Theory in Germany, during and after the Second World War. And this little book of 250, 300 pages gives this history of this particular debate in great detail. So for those of you who are really interested in that, there is more to be said. But let me just summarize it in very brief terms. So I think the first major contributor was Anthony Giddens, who said, we talk about structures. But what are structures? We think about structures. We think about all these buildings we pass when we came to this one. But he says social structures are not like that at all. They're not skeletons, they're not buildings, they're not anything concrete. They're the things that people have thought out. So if you think about marriage and the relationship between a man and a woman, that was thought out by societies 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years ago. It's being reshaped. In our time, it's being reshaped in a major way by what people think and what people want. And so that structure is changing its shape. In the same way, if you look at the World Bank or the IMF or some of these development structures, those are the results of thoughts. They have buildings, but the buildings can be used for something else, like churches are now being used for concerts in Europe. So the structure is not the definition of, or the physical space is not the definition of what a structure is. A structure is something that people devised intellectually, conceptually, and that created a reality that's being transformed all the time. So that was Giddens' insight. He calls that structuration, and he says that structures are really just long-term thoughts, patterns, residual memories, he calls them. He then stops writing about this and, starts writing about political things, and so we exit him. Then Pierre Bourdieu, the French social theorist, contributed to this in a major way too, by talking about the way in which we socialized and really get into habits. And he calls that life world in which we enact and come to these structures and come with our agency, he calls Habitus. And he says we all are constrained by that which we've grown up with. If you grow up in a society where a woman is seen in a certain light, it's very hard from the time you are 6 or 7 or 8 to challenge that. You need to go through a process of becoming more aware in terms of race, in terms of class, in terms of all of these kind of structural issues. He says we are socialized into positions, and he in fact says it's almost impossible to transcend those structures. So that's one of the things that Bourdieu is criticized for. But for things and capability theory like adaptive preferences, the habitus is an interesting and useful concept. The person who many of us now use is Margaret Archer. She follows on where Giddens leaves off, and she says, yes, it is true that agency forms structure and structure forms agency, but we have to separate them, because otherwise we just look at this joint animal and we don't understand it. So conceptually, she looks at agency as one thing and structure as another thing. All of these writers have written markers for how one engages. Giddens, for instance, says, not always under the conditions that you would have created yourself. You come in with agency and you want to change things, but they're always pre-existing conditions. They're always unacknowledged consequences, unintended consequences, unacknowledged conditions. So describing the kind of situation in which we engage with structures. Archer also puts this always within a relational ontology, so that whenever we challenge or work with structural ideas, she says, we are in conversation. Not necessarily physically me talking to you, but very often she says, we have inner conversations, and we have an inner debate. And if you're aware of that and you monitor yourself, you will find out how interesting it is and how often we do it. And from that then, she also uses the critical realism, which is rooted in a form of new Marxism that essentially looks at realities from the assumption that they can be changed, that they are always information and can go somewhere else. Then I've also brought in power into this, and when I started writing this, I realized it's too much. And even just this discussion about how agency and structure relate, and how we can, in the capability approach, if we wish, deepen that discussion is already one big thing. But let me just also say something about power, and if I write this paper, it's going to be part of that too. So, power and the dynamics of power at different levels are not sufficiently presented in the capability approach. That's another one of those, like the bootstraps critique. This is the other one that very often come up, that we do not engage with inequality and power, institutional power. So what questions can we link to that in the capability approach? I would say things like, where does the institutional power lie? Who makes decisions? Who has access to resources? Who has voice? So I'm arguing that in the capability approach, we really need to have, per definition, always some kind of contextual, other people have said it today, a political economy background. And then I'm arguing that particularly in those kind of moments in the capability process where you have articulation, where something happens, like in the conversion factors and adaptive preferences, and making a choice and engaging your agency, that's where we can look and deeply examine how power influences. So just to summarize, maybe the main point that I want to get across is, I think we will serve the capability approach well if we try to engage very specifically with how agency engages with capability as opportunity. Thank you.
Are you happy to take 2 questions?